I'm going to spread out.
Okay, good morning, everyone. So today we're going to be hearing from Dr. Jason Callahan. He is an assistant professor in the Criminal Justice Department. He earned his PhD in sociology at the Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University. Prior to being at the University of Southern Indiana, he served in law enforcement for over a decade in Virginia. During this time, he served as a patrol officer, crime scene technician, field training officer, and detective. Dr. Callahan's research interests include police culture, media and crime, and media representations of the criminal justice system. He has published scholarly articles in the Journal of Police and Criminal Psychology, the International Journal of Comparative and Applied Criminal Justice, Police Practice and Research, and the Journal of Criminal Justice Education. He is currently researching the effects of positive and negative coping skills for police officers and how this contributes to factors like career burnout, job satisfaction, and the buy-in to traditional elements of police culture. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Dr. Jason Callahan, and if there's any questions, we're going to save them for at the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. All right, so good morning. Thanks for coming, for those of you that are here. Thank you for the introduction, Christina. Like the slide here shows, I'm going to be talking a little bit about police podcasts. Like Christina said in my intro, I'm very interested in media and crime and sort of the evolution that we have with different forms of media that definitely have changed over the last, I would say, even just several decades, right? That we have much more access than we did before. We have different mediums, even though we still have traditional print news that's now digitized. We still have film and television, and the news, we still have other elements like podcasts, like really just blogs and things like that have really changed the way that people get their information and form impressions about not just the police, but the criminal justice system as a whole. And this is something that has really been, I would say, not just a big issue recently. I know that we had sort of, after the events in Ferguson, Missouri with, no, I'm blanking on the name now.
Brown?
Yeah.
Is it Michael Brown?
I can't remember what's his first name.
Michael Brown?
Yeah, Michael Brown, that's it. That we had sort of this spurned interest to start looking at police reform, something that even then President Obama had convened what was called the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, that he was trying to organize with major police chiefs across the entire country to have some form of organization, but also some uniformity amongst these police departments of how it is that they were going to approach police reform. We're trying to make it so that knowing that each police department kind of operates on their own little island, but having some consistency from one jurisdiction to another, and really trying to change the element from traditional policing, which had been much more focused just on solving crime or stopping crime rather than prevention, and trying to become much more ingrained within the community. So trying to change this from sort of a one-way street, that it was the police that had all of the control and all of the agency of how they're going to operate, and now start to invite in members of the community to become much more ingrained into what we now start to think of as community policing, which, as we'll get to here in a moment, is a very vague kind of concept and philosophy, even though it's something that is embraced by pretty much every major police department across the country now. But a big part of this is looking into how it is that communities will look at their police agencies as being legitimate, that are serving their needs, and this is based on their actions and how they treat people. So we have a lot of concepts like police legitimacy. We also have perceptions of how fair and procedurally just that they are with their actions and how much they're actually taking into account those that they're serving as far as their community, and not necessarily just saying, well, we're going to be very heavy-handed and we're going to solve crime. They're going to try to take actions to really be much more responsive to the community. So we're seeing much more of an offset of getting away from sort of this warrior mindset that a lot of law enforcement traditionally had, saying that they are going to war with crime, and they're being very staunch and in many cases very militaristic with the equipment they have, the way that they portrayed themselves, but also as they sort of took into some of these very traditional concepts of police culture of saying, I'm constantly in danger, I need to be on guard all of the time. And kind of changed that into more of a guardian type of a role, where they embrace, again, some of the needs of the community, And not to say that they are letting their guard down, but they are certainly not looking at the community as the enemy, the way that you would think of a warrior or someone that is at war has to have a combatant. And in many cases, unfortunately, that became the community, or at least the way that the community perceived us. So we see, again, sort of a, I don't want to say loosening of perspectives of the community, but much more of a community policing perspective that we are trying to embrace, that we're trying to have much more involvement. And unfortunately, while many of us in this room probably have heard the term of community policing, not everyone really knows what that is. And unfortunately, it's because a lot of this is very philosophical, it's very new in the scheme of things, right? If we look at sort of the different eras of policing, the community policing era that we are currently in really started around the turn of into the 2000s, getting into the 2010s, and we had more of an embracing of a community-oriented type of policing. Unfortunately, it's not the way that we had sort of evaluated police departments in the past, of saying these are exactly the types of things that you have to do to be considered in these different types of policing strategies. It was much more to say, we want to be much more frontward facing to the community, so that way we can be more responsive, we can go and show that if the community brings up, this is an issue that we have, we want our police department to be receptive to that, they can show that they're doing it. Unfortunately, though, we don't have a formalized way to say that every community is going to have the same problems, and thus we aren't going to have the same way that community policing is embraced or is instilled. The idea of the philosophy here, though, is that we're looking at the fact that the police have to obviously work with citizens of their communities. And this is much different than what our traditional policing models were, because before, again, like I said just a few moments ago, it was the police that were kind of deciding what the rules were going to be. That they were going to say how we are going to police our communities. And really, not that they didn't take input from the community, they didn't necessarily say that we had to integrate that into sort of what our modern policing processes were going to be. And I bring this up because most every modern policing agency will have, even just in their mission statement, if you were to look up the EPD or the Vanderbilt County Sheriff's Office, they have in their mission statement that they have a mandate that they are going to be community-oriented with their policing style. But that's really it. Unfortunately, as far as what that actually is going to look like or how it is that they formalize that, there's not a lot of information, which makes it really tough as a researcher to say, how much community policing do policing agencies actually engage in? Where we've seen sort of the ways that this has been measured is sort of the elements that we have of police legitimacy, something that we see that is very much a part of community policing, because this is the community's belief that their police agency has their best interest at mind. That they also respect the decisions of the police because they recognize the authority that they're using is just, and it's being appropriate, it's being properly used. They are not using heavy-handed tactics, they are not using force when it should not be used, but they are trying to do things that are going to be in the best interest of our community entirely, right? And this has implications towards not just police legitimacy, but also community policing, because this is going to generate feelings of trust in your community, right? If you think that an officer comes out and whether they make an arrest or they're just coming out taking a report, they're doing some form of conflict resolution, if they feel that that officer's actions are just, even if it wasn't necessarily the outcome that they wanted to have, but they understand the process, they're going to be more receptive and probably more likely to call the police because they had what they believe to be a good outcome, right? This also starts to look at that shared goals that you have between the police and the community. Again, it is not just, the law enforcement received a call for a possible larceny from an auto, right? And the police come out, they find a suspect, and it turns out to be someone that is, let's say, a juvenile or a first-time offender. There's no allegations of violence. And they come out and they say, well, we're going to lock this person up because they broke the law. We have enough probable cause to do that. An appropriate outcome could be that they advise what could be the possible options, or have diversion, or they create a situation where an arrest doesn't have to be the ultimate outcome, but it can still be positive towards the community. And if we see some of that, again, not to say that law enforcement should do everything they can not to make an arrest, but if there are other alternative solutions, this might better serve the community if we see it from that perspective. And where we start to also look into some connections that we have to procedural justice, again, we're looking at decision making. An outcome doesn't have to be that someone gets arrested. It may be that we're advising some resources in the community. It may be that we are trying to find better placement for an individual if they're receiving or they're experiencing some form of a mental health crisis, right? We have a lot of crisis intervention training that goes on with modern law enforcement. We have a lot of programs that are designed to give alternatives to arrest if that's the better outcome of what we're looking for. And oftentimes we're going to see that based on this quality of treatment, whether positive or negative, this is going to be indicative of how our community would feel, either from that person that experienced that situation with law enforcement, or anecdotally they have a friend or a neighbor or a family member or something like that that says, I dealt with so-and-so from the EPD and they were just terrible. I can't believe it. You should never call them because they're just going to come and they're going to lock people up or they're going to go and use force, and it's going to be a situation that there's no good outcome from it, right? That creates a lot of sort of division within our communities, whereas if you have something else that maybe you have a positive experience with, again, so we can even it out, right? I called the EPD because I had someone that was, they're severely depressed, they were thinking about suicide, and rather than, them just coming out and going and taking them for a non-voluntary commitment, maybe they found some other solutions, or they found some alternative that was a better fit, and I would feel great if, more officers acted like this, right? To create sort of these better positive impressions. And this can create better effectiveness, not just with that one situation, but if we're looking at controlling crime or crime prevention in the future, if we look at sort of the respect that individuals may have if there is a non-legal or extra-legal type of issue that goes on, maybe this is a neighbor dispute or a domestic dispute, but it's not an illegal activity, and we see that there's good, sound decision-making that goes on, you're probably more likely to respect these decisions, but also call again into the future. So we have a lot of bleed over with these that are not necessarily just focused on community policing the way that most people would think, as much as to say that these are creating better outcomes and better sort of mindsets that our communities want to call law enforcement to get them involved in these types of situations. And usually we have some evaluation, again, with police legitimacy and getting into some of these aspects of community policing, in that we have also many instances that we have law enforcement to go out of their way to create positive media portrayals of them, sort of counteracts maybe the situations in which maybe there's a large national story that oftentimes people will go and read that story or see that headline and they will have an outcome or an impression of the police that maybe is not favorable, right? Oftentimes law enforcement will go and try to counteract that locally by saying, hey, we had National Night Out, we had deputies and officers that were available to go and talk with young people, to go and have a barbecue, to have what we have locally where it's the coffee with a cop that the sheriff's department and the PD all interact with, right? To make sort of instances where the public can interact with law enforcement when they haven't been called, right? When it is more of a social element, and realizing that many of the people that work in these jurisdictions are also members of these communities as well, right? I think oftentimes we have sort of this disconnect between saying that just because you're a police officer does not mean that you don't also live in this community, right? That you're all kind of in this together. So in a sense, we're trying to bring people into the world of law enforcement by educating them. I know that both of our local agencies here have citizen police academies where they welcome in the public to kind of have a very, I don't want to say watered down, but a very brief form of what officers go through for the training academy. They have people that will go through basic EVOC things as far as driving things. They will take them to the firing range. They'll also explain to them when they have case law training or updates to that as they're looking at decision-making processes. To kind of give the community that glimpse into what it is that officers are trained to do, right? Because if we don't know exactly how they're trained, how are we to understand the decisions that they make and say, is this something that's appropriate and just? And where I'm looking at sort of the focus of this study, it's a long way of getting there, is how we're also integrating sort of community policing elements that are there. And again, a lot of my focus in the past has really been on sort of the way that media portrays law enforcement. This is an interesting opportunity that I've had to kind of reverse that. Most of the time, when we as researchers are looking at portrayals of law enforcement, it's coming from the news, or it's coming from television or film or some other type of source. The study that I'm going to do is actually going to be the way that a local law enforcement agency presents themselves to the public, right? So that they're kind of getting out in front of this, not necessarily to debunk, I guess, images that they may have, as much as to say, this is the type of services that we have, this is what we offer, and this is how we can present ourselves in a way that can maybe get rid of the blurry areas as far as what people believe the police do as opposed to what they actually do. And a lot of that is based on sort of this mediated experience, the sociological term of saying that oftentimes we don't know what all occupations do, right? And the way that we try to fill these gaps is the way that we look at the news. We gather information or we consume media, whether it is fictional or if it is a true crime or something like that. Oftentimes people, the only experiences that they have with law enforcement is if they get pulled over for a traffic violation, which is not a very good representation of what the job is that police officers do. But most people, in a lot of my classes, especially my intro class, I'll ask them, has anyone ever had an interaction with a police officer besides being stopped for a traffic violation? And it's in this very classroom, and there's 100 students, and I would have maybe 2 that would say, yeah, I've had other experiences with police officers besides that, right? But everyone has a very, in some cases, very overt opinion of what the police are supposed to do, but they don't necessarily have the education to be able to say why it is that they feel this way about the police, except for that they sort of simulate some of the anecdotes that they get either from other peers that they have or the type of media that they go and consume. It sort of fills this gap from lived experience to simulated experience. And so a lot of crime media will focus on that, especially if we're looking into some of the dramatized ways that police have been portrayed, especially in movies. You know, I have a lot of students that, even though this is an older reference, will think that Training Day is an accurate depiction of what law enforcement will look like. And I think we can all agree that's probably not the case, whether we live in Los Angeles or not, right? We don't have sort of Denzel that is doing anything that he wants and getting away with it, right? But there are a lot of people that will see that movie and be like, yeah, I think that's probably what policing is like, right? In some form or fashion, right? Knowing that it's fictional, but also they are taking away parts of it, especially if we're looking at the negative aspects with corruption and things like that, that they are, it's difficult for them to shake until they get into classrooms like these. And this is where I've had the opportunity to, in the past, look at sort of the different ways that now media has really changed in a way that we have almost unlimited access to the news, to entertainment or infotainment of many different sources, getting into film and television, but also if we're looking at social media itself, whether it's Facebook, it's Instagram, it is Twitter or X or whatever it is that it's called now, right? Getting into also podcasts and different ways that we can have sort of user-generated types of themes that will go on. Again, depending on who it is that is presenting this, we don't have a lot of ways to be able to vet the accuracy, I should say, of what these are going to be, right? If this is just someone that has a podcast and they're ranting and raving, and then you have a bunch of people to follow it, and they're like, yeah, I think that sounds right. Again, this is going to be difficult for people to go and overcome if they don't have the accurate information to do so. And knowing full well that we have sort of the way that, again, from a sociological perspective, we have a lot of these notions of cultivation of images or cultivation of impressions that has kind of been debated as far as how accurate this can be, but back in the 60s and 70s, there was a lot of research that was done by 2 individuals named Gerber and Gross that would say that based on the amount of television that's out there, that people are going to get most of their impressions of not just police, but the criminal justice system in a negative way based on how much television they're watching, right? We have the idea that when we watch the news, bad news is usually what leads, right? If it bleeds, it leads. The things that are interesting are people that are unfortunately victims of violent crime, if there's mass shootings, if there are these catastrophic events. Usually this gets the attention of viewers more so than people that are out there that are saying, hey, our local law enforcement agency had a barbecue with this neighborhood association, right? It's not good news because it's not entertaining, right? We see a blurred way of seeing how much of that will go on, and oftentimes we had seen prior to that people were looking and kind of creating this very cynical perspective of not just law enforcement or the criminal justice system, but humanity as a whole, right? And we've had a lot of research, including some that I had with a colleague of mine, that really focused on trying to dispel the way that we are looking at how people generate these portrayals of law enforcement, and that we shouldn't necessarily rely on one source, because of everyone that's in this room, we probably consume almost all of these, and in some cases, all of these different types of forms of media, right? We're not just watching television, we're not just watching films, we're not just going online or going on social media, right? And unfortunately, the way research has been done in the past really focused on just one of these, rather than seeing the totality. I actually had the opportunity in that study to go and put out a survey to intro students to say, what types of media are you watching, and how much is this influential on how you believe that your law enforcement is as a whole, right? Or just the industry of law enforcement. And many would say, even though they would consume a lot of these, and it kind of dispelled the way that we were looking at the way cultivation originally had been conceived, that they had positive viewpoints of what law enforcement could do, right? A a lot of this also you have to kind of think about the area in which many of these students are coming from, that they maybe already have positive viewpoints, or they're criminal justice students, so maybe they already have the belief that police are effective and just with their actions, that kind of supplements some of that. But again, a lot of them are saying, well, I'm doing, out of these 7 or 8, I'm participating or consuming 6 of these on a daily basis or on a weekly basis. So again, we can't necessarily look at one and say that's more influential than the other. So as we get into the current study, I know this is a lot of build-up to get there. The reason I preface this with a sort of media portrayal is that all of those are going to be sort of generated from whoever it is that's producing those news or those entertainment types of accounts or venues, right? This is a unique opportunity that I found, that I have a free and public podcast that is put on by a Midwestern police department that is there, that they get to generate the content that's there. They get to invite guests, or they get to sort of open up themes that they're presenting to the public that maybe they didn't know about, or maybe they didn't ask for because they didn't know it's something that existed. So went into sort of into depth of each of these podcasts. There's 15 in the season, quote unquote season that this agency presented. They're about 20 to 25 minutes in length. And some of the guests that we have seen that are on there are the current chief of police, various types of investigators or detectives that are there, from adult investigations to juvenile. We also have some SWAT officers, or some of your critical response team members that would be there, but also liaisons to other police organizations like the Fraternal Order of Police and some of our other organizations that are not necessarily policing in nature, but they have representation from police departments. So the characteristics of this police department, there are about 300 or so sworn officers that are there, meaning they've gone through police training, they've had the academy experience. There's also about 30 or so civilian individuals, and this could be anything from crime prevention to records management and things like that. So they are not necessarily out there answering call for service and doing police duties, but they interact with police employees on a regular basis. There's lots of different specialty units that this department has. They have their own SWAT team, canine, mounted patrol, crisis negotiation. They also have community policing and crime prevention liaisons. That's their whole job, is to sort of work in this crime prevention venue. Their CID, or the Criminal Investigative Division, has all sorts of specialty investigations there as well, from crimes against children, we have adult crimes, organized crimes, sexual violence, domestic violence. So they have quite a bit of diversity as far as what the responsibilities are. We don't necessarily have patrol officers that are asked to take on everything, or detectives that take on any type of further investigation. We have much more specialized training and things like that to go into it. As far as the jurisdiction itself, like I said, this is a Midwestern metropolitan area. The population is roughly about 115,000 individuals. It's about 45 square miles in the jurisdiction itself. And to give some context sort of the economic affluence, we're looking at about, on average, about $69,000 per household that is there, right? So relatively blue collar into sort of the middle class, right, as far as individuals that are there. Again, it is a metropolitan. It is designated as a city, which is different than what we think of with counties, as far as the population that's there, but also can get an idea of just the breadth of what it is that's there. And I'm sure if you looked really hard, you could figure out who it is, right? But for keeping this as something that, again, is I have the intentions of being able to publish here in some of these other journals. I want to make sure that we are not necessarily looking and focusing on this. This is not a policy evaluation of this department, as much as to say this is sort of the areas that we see that has some type of involvement. So what I am working on, although it's still a work in progress, as I'll mention here in just a few moments, I'm doing a content analysis of each of these podcasts, meaning that I'm going through each of these and having them transcribed and trying to generate themes. So I'm doing a thematic evaluation, specifically of the sort of elements that we have of police legitimacy that I outlined probably too much at length in the beginning or the front end of this year, but also to pair that with some of our community policing type of aspirations as well. So some of the research questions that I'm interested in is demonstrating sort of these elements of procedural justice, police effectiveness, and whether or not these are good measures to try to enhance this agency's perceptions of police legitimacy to the community. Like I mentioned, there are 15 of these in total. I've gone through 9 so far, so I still have 6 to go, so I'm over halfway. So I can at least give some preliminary results of what we have so far, some of the emerging themes that have gone on, right? We have, and I'll show some of the transcriptions itself that really kind of connect to each of these that are here, but some of the things that have been brought up numerous times are sort of ties that officers or these employees have to the area locally in which they serve, getting into community responses to the department, meaning sort of interactions that they have, advertising police services, like the different types of investigations that go on, these specialty units and so forth, getting into crime prevention, and then collaboration with outside agencies. We have a big part of modern policing is generating these multi-jurisdictional task forces that become very important, especially in the area in which we live, that you can go 10 minutes this way, you're in Illinois. You go 10 minutes, I guess, south, we're in Kentucky, right? We have so much that is right here just based on the uniqueness of the jurisdictional lines that we have to have collaboration with outside agencies, because bad guys and gals don't really care if they're in Illinois or Indiana or Kentucky, right? If they see a target-rich environment, that's where they're going to go to. But this does not mean that they always commit crimes in one location, that they bounce around. So we have a lot of information sharing and collaboration. And then finally, there's a piece that gets into sort of physical and mental health, leading to issues with retention and recruitment, but also employee burnout and things like that too. So as we look into, and I apologize for some of the larger block text that's here, but again, I'm trying to you keep this in the words of the individuals that are there and are being interviewed. When we are looking at sort of the ties to the community, something that's come up again and again in these podcasts are the individuals that have a lot of pride in knowing that they've either grown up in this area or they've grown up nearby this area or an area that's very similar, right? And that starts to show sort of what they have that is at stake. We'll see in one of these in a few minutes, and a lot of these will also highlight sort of the fact that these are individuals that have families. This one here has 3 kids, right? They live inside this jurisdiction where they serve, right? So they have a lot of investment that is there. And I think that oftentimes this is overlooked when you have police employees, that the uniform is sort of what's looked at, but not necessarily the person that's behind it at all times, right? And it's an important part to say, especially if you're focused on community policing, knowing that these are people that live in that community as well, that becomes very important. You have another that says, born and raised in the south side of this city. They have a big family. They have visions of also not just that they grew up in a large family, but they want to have this for their own as well, right? So this means that they also are invested in this community as far as its safety, because they want to raise a family there as well, right? This sort of counteracts some of the notions of traditional policing of being on your guard at all times and thinking that all members of the public are suspicious or potentially could do you harm. Sort of counteracts some of that by saying, well, I want to have a family that's here, right? So they are very much invested in making sure that this is a safe place, but they don't necessarily look at the community as a bad thing. This last one here looks at sort of a second generation officer that his dad worked in this agency, and he remembers a time that he was about 4 or 5 years old, and his dad came home with this big box and it had police uniforms in it, and he thought, how cool is this? My dad's a police officer, and really had a large sense of pride from an early age. And this is something that throughout this podcast he starts to go and say this is really what drove him into that direction, right? Not everyone falls in this sort of story arc, right? There are lots of individuals, myself included. I was a first generation police officer. I didn't have anyone in my family that was tied to that, and there are a lot of other officers that share that, but they see sort of the positivity that the occupation can have, and that's sort of what drew them to that as something that they felt was honorable and something that they wanted to participate in. As we get into some of the different responses that we have to the community, there are a lot of sort of conversations that were being had as far as trying to overcome some of our national narratives of what policing, some of the negative aspects are, and trying to focus this and say that, yes, while we understand that there can be a lot of things that maybe law enforcement has done that is accurate, right? If we're looking at George Floyd, if we are looking at Breonna Taylor, if we are looking at Michael Brown, or even getting earlier into Rodney King and other subsequent really highly publicized events of police use of force or police brutality, there are a lot of people that were saying, we're trying to push back against this because this doesn't reflect our department necessarily. Yes, we may have room to improve, and this is something that, especially if we're looking at the timeliness sort of what's going on within our own jurisdictions here locally, these are problems that we are still having. I'll kind of circle back to this here shortly, but you have a lot that are here to say we want our community to sort of embrace our law enforcement because we feel like we are serving them well, right? Obviously, this is not necessarily an open conversation. This is law enforcement that are saying we want to be positive, but you don't necessarily have sort of the community discourse that goes along with that. But you see a lot of times that there's a sort of large focus of trying to say we want to serve our community because we believe in it, and we want them to also trust and believe in us. As we're getting into some of the different policing services that go on, we have some members of the audience that know this full well, right? A lot of our local agencies have ride-along programs. I would say that most police departments and sheriff's offices throughout the country also have this. This is a way of getting individuals the opportunity to ride along with an officer on their shift and not knowing exactly what the outcomes are going to be, the unpredictability of being responsible to answering calls for service that come on the radio. Getting the opportunity to see this firsthand is something that is very, very much coveted in this role, right? This officer in particular says that this is a great tool to be able to literally test drive the job and come out to see what it's like with an officer, right? Because again, if we're trying to overcome this mediated experience and we're trying to say, well, if we have a lack of lived experience, how can we actually overcome some of these notions that we have unless we're in the car with them or if we're actually watching them or discussing things with them. So this ride-along program is something that is very coveted. Also very, very similar to that is the Community Academy that goes on. This agency in particular has, I believe it's a 6-week program that goes on where they invite members of the community, and each week it's sort of a different topic as far as what goes on. Oftentimes they also participate in these ride-along programs as well. And there are some individuals that actually say, I went to a Citizens Academy when I was younger, when I was either not on the fence, but before I actually entered this agency to work here, right? To give a good idea of sort of the issues and challenges that they may face when they're out there. We also saw a very strong prerogative for crime prevention. I mentioned that this agency has a crime prevention unit that is in place, right? So it makes sense that we have sort of this initiative or this directive to be very focused on trying to not just be responsive to crime, but to be able to prevent it from happening to begin with. And we have this individual here that is talking about that they wanted to bridge this gap between the community and their police department through crime prevention. There's another here that starts talking about community meetings. You think about neighborhood watch and things like that. But there are different housing associations that will actually gather. They have areas that could be within an officer's beat area that this may have a crime prevention officer that is solely there to go and be responsive in these situations, to attend these meetings, so that way they can hear what types of issues that the community is bringing up to say, these are problems that we're facing. We think that there's drug dealing that's going on, or we think that there's a lot of cars that are being broken into, or this is a place where a lot of houses have been burglarized, right? To get that information to law enforcement before it's actually been reported in some cases, or to make sure that they can see, well, what has our police department been doing in response to these reports as they've come out. Also, a lot of planned public meetings. In this instance in particular, we're looking at actually having things like barbecues, having organized law enforcement, not response, I hate to say it that way, as if they're responding to a call, but to say that they have planned outings that they are going to go to a certain restaurant and advertise this to the public to say, hey, come meet your local sheriff, or come meet your chief of police, or other members that are there, and ask them questions, right? Give them the venue where if you're not going to these community meetings, they still have the outlet to be able to do that. And again, this is just another example of our neighborhood association types of situations. Again, it gets to be a little bit redundant, but you see a lot of different ways or different avenues in which the community can actually go and interact with law enforcement without necessarily being a law enforcement situation, right? This last one I left on there, it's a whole lot to learn. And but the people, once you're out there in the neighborhood association and stuff, has been awesome, right? So you see, not just that they're doing this or paying lip service to community policing, they actually enjoy it, right? They get a sense of pride of connecting in this way. As we get into some of the different forms of collaboration, we see, based on the guests that were there, right, we have a lot of different sort of roles, whether this is internally or if we're looking at collaboration with outside agencies as well. In this particular example, we're looking at the fact that we have sort of collaboration with the mayor's office or the local politicians that are there, being responsive to things that are brought up there. We also see a lot of cross-training with other law enforcement agencies. In this case, that this police department is interacting with the sheriff's department. We also see a lot of overlap with EMTs and fire services and things like that. So we see collaboration not just with other law enforcement agencies, but with local government and also with other emergency services as well. This example goes into sort of an individual that is trained in their SWAT or CRT, crisis response team, and they're saying that there's specialties within, sort of, or cross-training within these units as well, where it's kind of just stuck out at me because it seems like such an odd thing to say if you're not sort of in the circle, but where is it? Just because you're a sniper doesn't mean you just sniper. You get to go and do a little bit of everything. I mean, it's such a unique job that that's something that is considered to be a normal thing to say, right? But in these circles where especially you have these specialty teams, it is more to sort of elaborate on the fact that you can be cross-trained to be able to do different roles within even the specialty team that's there. And one of the last things that I have that really to focus on this before we kind of get into rounding this all up is sort of the component that I briefly talked about at the onset, as far as looking at sort of the way that portrayals of law enforcement and criminal justice can be relatively cynical to members that are not there, right? And this is something that is contributing to a lot of burnout, a lot of mental fatigue, and a lot of, unfortunately, we have a lot of individuals that are also dealing with mental health issues as well, based on the profession and sort of the circumstances in which they are there. And we're looking at how leadership has been trying to address this, especially with this department in particular, right? That they're going through and having some of our wellness programs that are designed to provide mental health services to employees that feel like they need it. Unfortunately, with law enforcement in particular, there is sort of a stigma that follows with individuals that say, I am having sort of difficulties with the job as far as the mental processing. That has been very historic with the profession, unfortunately. Either from the standpoint of the community saying, well, how is this person going to be able to deal with this situation when they're already acknowledging they're having trouble with it, all the way through to the people that work with this individual that say, how can I expect this person to back me up or have my back in a critical situation if they're already saying they're hesitant with the way that they're dealing with the job or they're dealing with sort of what we think of with PTSD or anxiety or depression. So we've had nationally really a lot more of these types of wellness programs that have gone out. There's been much more of an open embracement of the acknowledgement that law enforcement goes through a lot of mental health burnout that can contribute also to whether or not they're going to stay within that profession. This individual here is the actual chaplain that works with this department, and it starts talking about how this also can impact family life as well. It's not just work life that can be impacted. There's unfortunately a very high national divorce rate amongst police officers that they will go and sort of bring the issues and the problems that they face at the job home with them, and the only other outlet they have could be their spouse or their children or other family members and things like that. So we've looked at sort of the other opportunities and outlets, whether it is a chaplain or if it again is sort of these wellness options that are there to be able to address and at least acknowledge that physical and mental health is a real thing, and that we're not just blindly covering our eyes and saying, no, everything's going to be fine. We train this person, everything is going to work out well for them. So to bring this back into sort of the conversation of what we have locally, right? We see a lot of elements and things that are very frontward facing, right? Coffee with a Cop is something that both the Vanderbilt County Sheriff's Office and the Evansville Police Department interact with on a regular basis, right? They have monthly times that they would go to Donut Bank, or they go to Parlor Donuts, or to any other number of places, and they invite the public to come out and say, hey, come have coffee with us, come have a conversation, come see that we are not necessarily just these very regimented, paramilitaristic individuals, right? We are real people. We wear a uniform. Yes, we have to enforce the law, but they're trying to present this sort of environment where they are approachable, right? Trying to overcome sort of the traditional standpoints that we had of police just doing whatever the police want and not necessarily acknowledging the community. So we have the representation of that. There's our current chief. There's Noah's not in one of these. We have a sheriff deputy that is there as well. as well as two of our PIOs from Evansville Police Department, including Taylor Maris and Anna Gray. And again, these are ways that if we're going to look at this locally, which is sort of the idea that we have these conversations that will go on in the national landscape, it's important for us to know also, well, what does this mean for us locally? And I had a conversation, I was hoping he would be here, but Chad Gonnerman, I had a hallway conversation with him, and he was asking about what I was going to talk about for the colloquium. And I was like, oh, well, I'm doing this kind of analysis of a podcast that a police department puts on. And he's like, well, what are you trying to get out of it? And I was like, well, I'm trying to see how they're presenting themselves to the community that they serve. And he's like, well, how does that really impact the national standard? And again, that's something that is a difficult thing, right? If we acknowledge that every community is going to be different, they are going to have different representation, they're going to have different diversity, they're going to have different levels of socioeconomic status, but also just problems as far as the types of crimes that they face, right? And I was trying to illustrate to him that what is going to work maybe in this area or this jurisdiction probably is not going to work in Chicago or Los Angeles or a larger city, because you have these different demographics. But it's also to kind of illustrate how difficult it can be as a researcher if we are so focused on these ideas of what is community policing. If we can't necessarily define what that is, it's tough from a research or an evidence-based practice to say how effective is it going to be. So at least in this situation, I can kind of present some of the connections to research that has been done in the past, specifically on police legitimacy and perceptions of procedural justice, to say, well, these are big elements of community policing. While we're not necessarily, and my focus here isn't on community policing itself as much as some of these aspects that exist, at least we can maybe get an idea of whether or not this podcast in particular represents these tenets that have been clearly established through research, right? Because again, if we're looking at a philosophy and not necessarily a formalized strategy, it gets to be difficult. In this study here that I had done several years ago, we went out and actually talked with a lot of different chiefs of police and sort of the upper echelon of these departments to say, what types of community policing efforts do you have? And every one of them said, well, we want to be very responsive to the community. We want to be out there. We want to be approachable. And so we would try to follow up and say, well, how are you doing that? And they would say, well, it depends. We try to organize some of these events, but it was very vague. It seemed like it was very haphazard. And unfortunately, we see sort of the transition from our traditional policing into community policing. You had to have buy-in from the entire department for it to be successful. And unfortunately, you would have some of our older generations of law enforcement that have been so steadfast in their ways of these tenets of police culture and traditional policing that they're like, I don't want to do this touchy-feely stuff, is I think the way that it was termed, right? I'm not a social worker, I'm not out to do that type of thing, but that's an imperative part of community policing, sort of these things that we talked about. So with the vagueness of these philosophies, sometimes that's in mind because we don't know how much, I guess, I don't want to say authenticity, but how much that they're actually doing the things that they say, or how much that they're actually buying into this, or how much they're just presenting to the public to say, well, yeah, of course we're community policing focused, because it's like to say that I'm not going to be, strong on crime, right? Or I want to be tough on crime, I should say, right? That's like a death sentence for politicians. It's almost the same way for a lot of local law enforcement, where they say, of course we're going to be community-oriented with our policing, because that's sort of what the national narrative is at this point. But it's difficult to really say, well, how much are they actually involved in this? And this gets to be very important. This is sort of the takeaway point from a lot of this as well, is that even if you have jurisdictions that have good ties and relationships with their police departments, this is something that is very fragile, and something that we've seen, especially recently, sort of the national way. You think about the amount of disrepair that Minneapolis is dealing with in the wake of George Floyd, right? You can go and say, I want to be focused on community policing, but how much does that community want to interact with that police department, right? You have to look at how tenuous that this can be, and that when you have some of these incidents that go on, even if they're not to that type of stage, how fragile that this can be as far as maintaining this. I use the metaphor a lot of times with community policing as almost like it's gardening, right? If you neglect it, you don't pay attention to it, it's going to die, right? The same way that these relationships will, in the metaphorical sense of what these plants are. That if you're not constantly giving it attention, if you're not constantly tending to it, these are relationships that will disappear. And you're not going to have the strength even if you had something like that in the past. And just to close, we see that here locally with our local agencies as well, right? We have the EPD that's up here with their Citizens and Police Academy. I think that a lot of us acknowledge that a lot of the interactions that the EPD has with the city of Evansville have been largely positive. But then we have last week, we have an officer-involved shooting, right? That were demonstrations even just over the weekend when the mayor was there for the Christmas tree, that you have protesters that are saying, you know, based on the officer's actions, that this was not something that was just, right? That this was someone that did not give the opportunity for this person to go and put down what was perceived to be a weapon, right, before he was ultimately shot and killed. These are things that you see that even the day before, hours before, even if you have these positive views of what's going on, it's something that can certainly be tempered, or in some cases, you can have a lot of mistrust now that you have in that agency that happens from one incident. Whether it's representative of the entire department or not, it still exists, right? And we see that firsthand. You know, here again, we have the Sheriff's Department that's at National Night Out, and we had, you know, I think within the last 6 months or so, we had an inmate, well, I don't think they had just died, but I think they had sued about the conditions that were going on. This is reflective of the Sheriff's Department because they maintain the local jail that's here. So Noah Robinson, who's known to have a very good relationship with Vanderbilt County, still has to deal with this. And you're still having a lot of individuals. I've talked with Laura Lucky Nieves, who, you know, does a lot of research that's based on the conditions of jails, and both of us were scrolling through social media and seeing the comments of people for this particular story and saying, well, I served time in that jail too, and it's horrendous. The conditions there are terrible, and like really going in to try to convince everyone else on the outside world that these are the worst types of conditions and deplorable circumstances that you could ever have, right? And these law enforcement agencies, even if they have a good reputation with their constituents, still have to deal with this. They have to counteract that in ways that they can disprove that what this person is saying is the truth, because now you have other individuals, it's kind of in summation here, right? They're on social media, that are looking at this from a bubble to say, well, this person says they were there and it was awful, right? What if I should believe that this is true rather than maybe what our law enforcement agency is telling us, right? So again, this idea of community policing is something that's very fragile and so tenuous and really can be interrupted by things that you would think, not necessarily, not to trivialize either of these types of examples, but if you have someone that's just commenting on something on social media, how much of an effect is that going to have if they have followers, right? Something that, again, traditional law enforcement did not have to deal with in the past. All right, that's my talk. Thank you guys for being here. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have or have any open discussions with you.
So thank you so much.